Johnny Tremaine, Chapter 11, Section 2. On Cornhill, Johnny could feel the subdued excitement. Everyone knew something was happening. No one knew what. Doors and windows were open, people hanging out, calling back and forth, or gathered in knots in the street. Johnny kept his eyes and ears open. Everyone knew about that secret expedition last night. Colonel Smith had embarked or gone out with 700 men and landed in Cambridge. That Gage was sending over at least 1,000 fresh troops to support him, anyone might guess. There's tons of evidence of it. But the people of Boston knew no more than Gage that the fighting had begun. Johnny went to the Province House, that would be another tavern. All was as usual. The sentries were on guard. Young officers lounged about. One was already in his cups. That means he had been drinking, even though it was only 8 in the morning. Johnny could see that a group of them were playing at cards in the south parlor. Perhaps they were finishing off the game they had begun last night. He knew which was General Gage's bedroom. The curtains were still drawn. That means the curtains were closed. Colonel Smith's early call for reserves evidently had not upset the commanding officer. He had given the order which set Percy's 1st Brigade in motion, had rolled over, and gone to sleep. So essentially, Colonel Smith, as soon as he got to Lexington, was all like, I need reserves. I need some backup guys. His call for reserves. So it had eventually gotten to General Gage. General Gage woke up, said, Hey, Earl Percy, send your troops up to Cambridge. And then he went back to sleep. So then Johnny went to the Common. He had already seen the tail of Percy's brigade lashing about Dr. Warren's house. The head of this scarlet dragon lay upon the Common. So I want to point out that this is a great piece of figurative language. This is a metaphor comparing Percy's brigade, the soldiers, to a scarlet dragon, which is a very common thing in the military. Military troops and even marching bands, which are kind of derived from the military, have been using their marching to intimidate enemies for about forever. This troop formation here is the Penn State marching band about to eat up Ohio State in a truly epic game that we won a couple years back. It was worth it. So anyway, Scarlet Dragon is those 1,000 men. However, the men were restless, grumbling, spitting, shifting their heavy equipment. Some had already been standing about for 3 hours. Johnny learned from one of their camp women what was causing the delay. They were waiting to be joined by a detachment or a group of Marines. He looked about and saw for himself these 1,200 men were taking with them cannon and baggage wagons. So with baggage wagons, we can assume that the length of their trip is expected to be longer than the overnight stay that Colonel Smith had told Dove to expect. The tension among the inhabitants, the Boston people, was growing. What had happened? What was going to happen? Shops and schools were closed, and Johnny met a wreath of tiny children advancing and chanting, School's done, war's begun. It looked to him they were shrewder or cleverer guessers than their elders, who were trying to believe that not a shot had been or would be fired. Then from over North Boston way came the brisk rattle of drums. The 500 Marines, billeted all about North Square, arrived at double quick. They took their places in the ranks. Some were still buckling their equipment or eating the bread that had been tossed to them. They had been hours late, but when they had been notified, they came fast. So basically, this is saying that it wasn't the Marines themselves who were late to the party. Whoever was commanding them was a little bit late. So tagging after them, looking half awake and half dressed, Johnny recognized an old acquaintance, someone that he had known but wasn't really a friend with. It was Madge, even fatter since her marriage, and seemingly more in love than ever. Tears streamed down her thick red cheeks, and all old animosity or hatred forgotten, she flung herself upon Johnny. I can't bear it, but he says he's got to go. Nearby, tough little Sergeant Gale was strutting about like a bantam cock, roaring at one of his men whose buttons did not shine. So if we remember, Madge had run away to get married to this little sergeant. Remember, he was so small that her sitting on his lap, Johnny had wondered at. And he was a little guy. He's a sergeant for the Marines. But now he is strutting about like a bantam cock, which is another name for a type of rooster. So if you think about what you know about roosters, when they go to crow, they make their big loud noise and they puff up their chests and they just think they're so cool, they're better than everyone. And this rooster obviously thinks he's better than you, and Sergeant Gale does too. Or at least he acts like it. So anyway, he's pretending not to know that his wife was so nearby. He was really showing off in front of her and approved her presence. Men go to war, and women wept or cried. All was as it should be. Sure, he's got to go, Johnny comforted Madge, but people say Gage is just sending out the brigade for exercise. They've been sitting about barracks catching fleas all winter. Why were the Marines late? Gage sent a letter to Major Pitcairn telling him to parade his men, but Pitcairn wasn't home. Pitcairn went off last night, second in command to Colonel Smith. Did you know that? The Marines didn't know until about 10 minutes ago. Remember, at the end of chapter 10, we saw Major Pitcairn's white horse getting on the boat next to Sandy, going up to Cambridge, and we had suspected that it was Major Pitcairn who had gone with, of course. Johnny had to laugh. It certainly would harden or encourage Dr. Warren when he heard how stupid the British had been. Gage had forgotten the Marine Major had already gone, had sent him a letter, and then turned over for another snooze. This is a great way for the author to characterize General Gage. This is a man who is trying to send out 1,200 men and then goes back to bed. He doesn't seem to care very much. So either that means he's a terrible general or he's not worried. Suddenly, there was silence along the whole great length of the brigade. Slim Earl Percy on a horse, escorted or surrounded by a group of officers, was cantering slowly across the common. 5 mounted men. The sun was bright that day, with only breeze enough to ruffle the horses' manes, the hair at the back of their heads, to flaunt or show off scarlet riding capes, to float the flag of England. Johnny was an Englishman. If we remember, everyone who lived in America at that point was an Englishman. Because England was in charge of America, every single person there was themselves a citizen of England. So Johnny was an Englishman. The sullen, the cranky, rebellious people standing about watching Percy and his staff approaching, waiting for the brigade to march. All were Englishmen. That flag, it stood for Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Charles I's head upon a block, centuries of struggle for English liberty. But over here, there had grown up a broader interpretation of the word liberty. No man to be ruled or taxed except by men of his own choice. But we are still fighting for English liberty, and don't you forget it. French slaves to the north of us in Canada, Spanish slaves to the south of us in Florida and other southern states. Only English colonies are allowed to taste the forbidden fruit of liberty, we who grew up under England. Johnny thought of James Otis's words, upholding the torch of liberty, which had been lighted on the fires of England. Not since the soldiers had come to Boston had Johnny removed his hat when the British flag went by, except once when it had been knocked off his head by a soldier. He started to remove it now, for the first time and doubtless the last. Thought better of it. It was too late. He knew the shooting had begun. So I want you to take a moment and compare this to a time when you've maybe seen the national anthem played and how people in America react to that. If you've ever been to a baseball game, you know that people stand up, they put their hands over their hearts, and they take off their hats. That is a way to show respect for your country and to show that you're proud of it. So Johnny is saying that this flag, the British flag, which is just being pushed out a little bit by the wind, so it looks all beautiful, it represents the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and King Charles's head upon a block. So let's dissect that a little bit. The Magna Carta, that's Latin for the big charter or the big agreement, was written in the year 1215. So, what is that, 700 years ago? No, 800 years ago? Oh my goodness. So 800 years ago, this was created, and it set up some basic rights. No new taxes would be passed without at least some kind of representation, protection from illegal imprisonment, fair trials, protection of church rights, essentially saying you can't just throw a person in jail because you don't like the way they smell. They have to, have had some real legal reason to be imprisoned. And King Charles's head upon a plate would reference King Charles, who, after King John signed it, King Charles tried to overturn the Magna Carta, and the British were not having any of it. They fought for British liberty. And then only less than 100 years before Johnny Tremain takes place, in 1689, the English Bill of Rights was signed. And this and the Magna Carta are where we base our own American Constitution, our own Bill of Rights. It limits the power of the king. It gives freedom of speech. All of those wonderful rights that we enjoy in the U.S., a lot of them came from the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta. So essentially, Esther Forbes, our author, is trying to show how proud Johnny would ordinarily feel about being English. But he feels really conflicted. He feels like, there's a broader interpretation of the word liberty, that the British aren't done. They haven't done enough. And so the Americans have to take it further. And we can even see where Esther Forbes would have been adding in her own interpretation by adding in the parts about the French and Spanish slaves. Just 10 years later, in 1789, the French would have an enormous revolution to have their own freedom. The Spanish would later have theirs later in history. And of course, the American slaves were freed in the Civil War. So we've got all of these ideas, these conflicting ideas of liberty. And Johnny, he's starting to remove his hat. He's about to show how proud he is to be an Englishman, but he stops. It's too late. He's no longer an Englishman. So that's a pretty big turning point for Johnny. So as you're thinking about your upcoming essay, this is a really powerful point to bring up about Johnny's growth. So the sword in Earl Percy's hand flashed. There was a command which was instantly picked up and repeated and echoed and repeated again. The regimental drummers struck up. So we're about to move. The artillery horses, the horses who would drag the cannons, the artillery, they threw their weight against their collars, starting to move the artillery. The wagoners cracked their whips, and the Scarlet Dragon swung forward, sluggishly or slowly at first, heading for the town gates. Thousands of separate feet merged into only one gigantic pair. Left, right, left, right. The earth shook to their rhythm. Johnny watched them pass. Every button was sewn on, every buckle in place, every cartridge or bullet box held exactly 36 cartridges, every musket had a bayonet, and there was not one old fowling piece, any old junky guns among them. Every horse had 4 new shoes. It was a magnificent sight, but Johnny felt a little sick. So if you think back to history class and compare these extremely well-equipped British soldiers to how the American soldiers were armed, if I were putting a bet versus the British and the Americans, I think I'd bet on the dragon. What chance, what shadow of a chance had these poor, untrained, half-armed farmers at Concord? Oh, God, be with us now. But even as he prayed, he kept an eye out for the regimental markings on the men's uniforms. It was the 4th, the 23rd, and the 47th who were being sent out, plus 500 Marines, plus a small artillery train and a few baggage wagons. 1,200 for a guess. The drums throbbed, the heavy dragon marched on its thousands of feet, and now above the drums came the shrilling or the singing of the fifes. Remember, the fife is a small flute, a type of whistle that would be played in accompaniment to the drums. They played a tune they always played when they wished to insult Yankees. For once more, Yankee Doodle was going to town on a spanking stallion with that forlorn feather in his cap, asking those unmilitary questions. You might know the tune Yankee Doodle. So that's the song Yankee Doodle, and nowadays we think of it as a patriotic song, but in the early days of the American Revolution, it was a way for the British to make fun of the Americans. But anyway, poor Yankee Doodle. Whatever could he do against this great scarlet dragon? And before we close out this video, I want you to really think about the tone that the author has put into the end of this piece, showing us how well prepared this British army is, showing us how desperately underprepared the Americans are. This is an extremely negative tone. The author is implying that the Americans are about to be crushed. Why do you think that might be?